Hey Optimancers, it's me, I'm on camera. And today I am going to do a topic, and that's why I'm on camera, that was requested by a patron. And that was if I was to steal some rules from other games. I think they said if there were 5 rules you would steal from other games for D&D, what would they be? Now, when it comes to the modern role-playing games, I generally just play D&D these days. I once in a while might play something else, but I don't own any of the new books for Fate or Numenera or Blades in the Dark. These are all currently very popular role-playing games, and I don't own them, and I have minimal experience with them. So in those cases, I can't think of a single example of a rule I would steal. But before I played 5th edition, I did play lots of other role playing games. I have a bookshelf filled with role playing books from games I used to play. And for the most part, I think 5th edition is better than any of those games. But there are still things in those games I think worked really well. And I started to look at them. I started to go through those books and look for rules that I thought were neat and rules that we could implement in D&D and maybe get some positive results from. So that's my topic for today's video. 5 rules I would steal from other role-playing games for D&D. If you like the content on this channel and you would consider supporting me through Patreon, you can do so. There is a link in the video description. Patrons of this channel can see these videos early and without YouTube ads. And my top level patrons join me and play one-shots of D&D every month. Today I want to thank these top level patrons: Stephen Edmondson, Stephen Saul, Steve Bouvel, TUM, Taco Knight, Tazel, Thomas Barrero, Tristan Bello, and Xandar the Mighty. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. So first up, we have Shadowrun. Let's see if it shows up. There we go, Shadowrun. Now, this is 2nd edition Shadowrun. It doesn't matter what edition of Shadowrun you're playing, the mechanics are going to be a mess. They never seem to get the mechanics right for Shadowrun, but thematically, very cool system, kind of combines kind of Dungeon Dragons with cyberpunk would be the best way to describe it, I think. And like I said, for the most part, these rules are terrible. In fact, I wondered whether I should even bother going through this book. But then when I found something pretty cool. And that was their rules on foci, or the spell focuses for their game. And the way spell focuses work in Shadowrun is that you don't need them to cast spells. But if you use them to cast spells, the spells end up being cast more effectively. Now, the mechanics involved in how those spells would be cast more effectively don't translate nicely to D&D, so I had to think about if we were going to use this concept, this idea in Dungeons & Dragons, how would we implement it? So how would we steal this rule? And I think what we would do is, first off, we'd go through all the spells in D&D and the material component for any spell that doesn't involve a costly component would be removed. And so that's every single spell that can use a spellcasting focus. Now, no spellcasting focus would be required for any of those spells. And then what you would do is you would have spell focuses, and the classes would get access to the same spell focuses they have now, so that wouldn't change. But if you are holding a spell focus when you cast a spell, and it is a usable spell focus for you, then you have the option of casting through that focus, and then you would get a mechanical benefit. And I was thinking about what kind of mechanical benefits might they be. Well, I would think you would have some options that a player could choose from. So maybe they get a +1 to their spell save DC. Or maybe they could remove a different component, like they could remove a verbal component or a somatic component. Or maybe after casting it, they would have advantage on Constitution saves in order to maintain concentration. So you would give them those few options to do. But what would be different is, number 1, focus not required for casting a spell. And number 2, they would need to hold the focus if they want to get that benefit. So what that would mean is if a spell has a somatic component and you're casting through a focus, well then you would need 2 free hands, one for the focus, one for the somatic component. So why would I want to steal this? Well, number one, the focus rules in Dungeons & Dragons are not good. They're ridiculously complex. Knowing whether you need a free hand to do somatic components or not, it's really convoluted. Whether you can cast with your hands full or not, really convoluted. And of course, you don't even need to hold a focus. You can just touch a focus. And here, what it would do is the focus is really going to do something, but you don't need it. And it would be pretty clear what the effect of that focus is, and the player would have some control over that. After I finished recording this video, I thought of another way that this rule change would be good, and that is for the College of Spirits Bard. College of Spirits Bard gets a class feature or subclass feature where they can use their spirit focus to get a bonus to a damage roll or a healing roll of a spell as long as they cast through the focus. Problem is, apparently the designers don't even know their own rules for spell focuses, and showing again how convoluted they are. So most bard spells can't be cast through a focus. And if a spell can't be cast through a focus, then the Spirits Bard doesn't get their bonus that their subclass feature says they're supposed to get. There's like a couple spells, like the Shatter spell, the Regeneration spell, that can be cast through a focus, but far and away, the healing spells and damaging spells that bards can do can't be cast through a focus, so the College of Spirits Bard loses out on a subclass feature. So that would fix that problem with that subclass feature. So I think that is something we could steal from the terrible system of Shadowrun and make Dungeons & Dragons better. Next game up is Alternity. Now, if you haven't heard of Alternity ever before, you can be forgiven because it didn't do very well. This was the dying days of TSR, and Alternity, probably the last role-playing game they introduced before they went bankrupt. And they primarily went bankrupt because of poor management of second edition. But Alternity is a very different game than Dungeons & Dragons. This is actually a science fiction game. And for the most part, I thought it actually worked pretty well. Terrible rules for cybernetics kind of ruined the game a bit, but the rest of the rules all were kind of unique, different than other games we had seen, and they worked reasonably well. I played this a number of times, and it was pretty fun. So I took a look through this book again to see if there were any rules that I thought would work well in Dungeons & Dragons. I don't think there are any simple rules we can steal, but I do think there are some rules we could steal if we want to make 5th edition a little bit more complex. And those rules would be the rules for the situation die. So here we find rules on the situation die in Alternity. And essentially what a situation die is instead of having advantage or disadvantage, in Alternity, if the DM felt there was something that would provide advantage, you would get a bonus situation die. And if the DM thought there was something that would involve a disadvantage, you would have a penalty situation die. What you would do is you would roll your check, and you would roll the situation die as part of that check, and you would either add or subtract the result from your total. Now, how would we steal this for D&D, and why would we want to? Well, the nice thing about situation dice is, unlike advantage and disadvantage, they can add up. So let's say we have a situation where we all know that once you have advantage and disadvantage, they don't stack anymore. So let's say you're in a fog cloud and you're attacking an enemy. Well, right away, they can't see you, so you have advantage. But you can't see them, so you have disadvantage. So the roll is now going to be straight up, and it doesn't matter what other modifiers are in play. They might be prone, you might have reckless attack. It all doesn't matter anymore. Because of the fog cloud, we've negated everything. And it doesn't matter how many different things that might provide additional advantage to you that add up, they don't count for anything. On the other hand, if the target of the attack had other things that should help to their defense, maybe they were dodging, maybe they had the blur spell. Doesn't matter. Again, they don't add up. So all that stuff is simply negated. Now, from a simplicity point of view, that's kind of elegant because essentially what it does is it makes it easy. We have one case of advantage, we have one case of disadvantage, we're done. It's a straight up roll. But if we did want to have things kind of add up, advantage and disadvantage don't work anymore. So now what we need to do is we need a different system. And the situation die is exactly the system that could work. So what would happen is if something would normally provide you advantage, so let's say you had reckless attack. So you're attacking with reckless attack, what would happen is you would do a straight up roll, but you would also have a d4, and that d4 would add to your result. Now, if there were multiple cases of advantage, so maybe you have reckless attack and you receive the help action, well then that d4 would become a d6. And let's say you had another source of advantage. Maybe you have Vow of Enmity and you've used it on the enemy. So now that d6 would become a d8. But then maybe there's some things causing you disadvantage. Maybe the enemy has done the dodge action. Well, then you would move that die down a step. So it would go from that d8 to a d6 and so on and so forth. And so if there's a complete balance between things that would add or subtract from your chance of succeeding, it's going to be a straight up roll. But if there isn't, then you're either going to be adding a penalty die or an advantage die. And that die type is going to scale. So it would start at a d4, become a d6, d8, d10, d12, and then it would become a d20, and then 2d20, and then 3d20, etc. Now, that many cases of advantage or disadvantage happening in one check is pretty much impossible, or very, very unlikely, but the system would be there in those cases. Most of the time, I imagine you'd be adding d4s or maybe d6s. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, because although the advantage and disadvantage system is simple, it doesn't always make sense. Because if your opponent is prone, attacking them with advantage in melee makes sense. But suddenly if you're in a fog cloud, you don't get advantage. You don't get any advantage for them being prone. That doesn't really make sense, does it? So with this system, you would be able to have it make a little more sense. And there would be actually reasons to apply more than one type of advantage or more than one kind of disadvantage. Now I keep thinking of things why I like these rule changes more and more the more I think about them. So with the situation die, I'm thinking if you really wanted to leap down that rabbit hole, you could make significant changes to the base game of Dungeons & Dragons, and I think it could work really well. Just imagine, let's say the Bless spell didn't provide a bonus d4, it provided you +1 situation die on attack rolls and saving throws. Let's say that weapons aren't +1, +2, or +3. Maybe they add 1, 2, or 3 situation dice. We could just combine all these benefits, all these disadvantages into one system so that every roll is a d20. There's no flat modifiers. It's just a situation die. That's either a bonus or a penalty. Although the system's more complex altogether, there is a certain level of simplicity we're adding. The second thing is, if we care about bounded accuracy, this is something that could really save bounded accuracy. I think in the optimization community, we understand that bounded accuracy is a nice idea that the designers have been unable to maintain, especially with all the new rules and all the options that can be taken advantage of. We can get armor classes where enemies cannot hit us, and we can get saving throw DCs that enemies cannot save against, and vice versa. And this would actually prevent that because we're adding a die, and it doesn't matter if it's a d12. A d12, you can still roll a 1, you can still roll a 12. That means with the situation dice, there's still always going to be the chance of failure and the chance of success. Even if we're adjusting the percentages, we're never going to get to 100% or 0%. So that would actually be kind of nice. And that would require a major change to the base rules, though. So TSR, was going broke at this point, but they still had some good ideas. So I started role-playing in the early 80s, like it was 80 or 81, and I started with Dungeons and Dragons. And at that time, we played basic Dungeons and Dragons, and then we switched to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which is known now as First Edition. And we played that a lot. In fact, we played it exclusively. Then Second Edition D&D came out, and they wanted us to buy a bunch more books, and there were a lot more systems out there at that point. And although I bought the Second Edition books and played Second Edition a few times, we actually found that other systems were more robust than D&D. In fact, Second Edition D&D is really a lot like First Edition D&D. It's more of a 1.5 than a Second Edition, in my opinion. Now, the system that we used most often at that point was called GURPS. GURPS stood for Generic Universal Role-Playing System, and it was produced by Steve Jackson Games. Steve Jackson Games now, of course, is best known for the Munchkin board game, but back then they were best known for role-playing games. Now, GURPS is a system that a few years ago I decided, feeling kind of nostalgic, that I might go back to and run a campaign in. So I kind of created this campaign and got some friends together, and we played GURPS for maybe 3 sessions and decided, it just didn't age well. It got really clunky. But I'll tell you what, there is a Steve Jackson game that I think has aged much better, and that is my next example, which is In Nomine. Now, In Nomine was quite different than GURPS. Entirely different system, of course. Far more simple. Now, in Nomine, you would play an angel or a demon, and the entire party were angels and demons. So if I was to go back and watch a movie like The Prophecy, or even sometimes when I would watch like the TV show Supernatural, it would remind me of In Nomine, and pretty good memories. This was a pretty good system, I thought, and a pretty fun game. It didn't take itself too seriously. It's not overly dark, almost kind of comic booky in a way, and a lot of good ideas in here. Now, the one I kind of picked out in thinking about how we might take something and put it in D&D, I think would be relatively dramatic. So I'm not necessarily saying that this is something you might want to throw in your next campaign, but if you were going to run a one-shot or something, it might be something you want to try and see how it works. And specifically, the rule I'm thinking about is their rules for combat actions. So they have the rules here for combat summary, and the initiative order works differently in In Nomine than it does in Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, in Dungeons & Dragons, we know you roll initiative, you put all the characters in order, and then you run through them, and then you run through them again. But in Nomine, also, you would roll initiative, you would put everybody in order, but what they would do is you would go through the order, and anyone who had a supernatural action to take could take that supernatural action. And that's all they could do. Then you would run through the initiative order again, and anyone who hadn't done a supernatural action already that turn could now do a non-supernatural action. Now, if we were to compare this to D&D, a supernatural action would be most comparable to a spell. So if we were to just take this rule and apply it to D&D, what we would do is we would roll initiative as normal, and then working our way down the initiative, you would only take your turn if you were casting a spell on your turn. And then you would run through again, and anyone who's not casting a spell would take their turn. Now, I think that would be a horrible thing to do to your Dungeons & Dragons game, because the thing is that spellcasting is already more powerful than not spellcasting. And in In Nomine, all characters had supernatural abilities, but in D&D, not all characters have spells. So what you're doing is you're taking all the characters that don't have spells and making it worse for them. And the thing is that, at least in my opinion, spellcasting is already the most powerful thing you can do in Dungeons & Dragons. So if you were to give them another boost and give non-spellcasters another penalty, I think it takes things that are already bad and makes them worse. But what if we were to take the idea of this and then flip it on its head? So what if we were to roll initiative, and then we would work our way through initiative, and everyone could take their turn if they were not casting a spell. And then we would go back to the top of the initiative, and anyone who was casting a spell could then take their turn. Now, this would be a huge penalty for spellcasting, and I question how it would actually work out in play. But I think it might be just the thing to make spellcasting and non-spellcasting a little more equal than they are now. In addition, I think that when you have characters that have spellcasting options and non-spellcasting options, it would actually create a little bit of incentive to maybe do the non-spellcasting option. So that's just the idea I had from glancing through my old In Nomine book. Highly underrated game, in my opinion. So that brings us to our fourth rule I would consider stealing. And this is from, I've been asked multiple times, what's my favorite game for role-playing that isn't Dungeons & Dragons? And I think a lot of people expect me to say Pathfinder, because I certainly played a lot of Pathfinder. I certainly wrote guides for Pathfinder. But really, my actual favorite role-playing game that isn't Dungeons & Dragons is Deadlands. Now, this is the original Deadlands. I know there's been multiple editions since then, but many, many hours of fun playing Deadlands. Now, Deadlands, one of the things I like about it is, of course, you get to play a different kind of character that fulfills some of the tropes you enjoy from Westerns, like the narrow-eyed gunslinger or the cocky gambler or whatever. But when I watch Western movies, I enjoy Westerns. They often give me nostalgic feelings for Deadlands because I was able to play those kinds of characters in this game. The other thing is the mechanics of this game are pretty good. And they incorporate a lot of things that add to the flavor as well as working well mechanically. So if you play Deadlands, you will use dice, you will also use cards, you will also use poker chips, and they will all play a significant part in the game. And there were just like really smart things here, like the mage style character would deal themselves a poker hand, and depending how good the poker hand is, would determine how effective the spell was. And I just thought that was genius. Now, the one thing about Deadlands, or any game that is going to do the Wild West, is you need some system to take care of the stare down, right? So if we're talking about classic Westerns, there's going to be a shootout. And at the shootout, I mean, they draw, but before they draw, there's this great moment where they're kind of staring at each other intensely, and maybe one of them breaks a bit, and you know they're dead, right? Like, it's over before the guns are ever drawn. So they have a system for that in Deadlands. They call the Test of Wills. And I wondered, does Test of Wills really work for fantasy? And it occurred to me, yeah. I mean, if you read fantasy, the Test of Wills is vitally important, and for the most part, basically ignored in Dungeons & Dragons. But if you read Lord of the Rings, you will find that there is a huge test of wills between Sauron and Pippin through the Palantir, and Pippin is basically dominated. But then later on, Aragorn uses the Palantir and does a test of wills against Sauron, and Sauron is intimidated and tricked into believing that Aragorn is his biggest threat, and so he dedicates his forces and his attention elsewhere so that Frodo and Sam can sneak into Mordor. And then finally, Denethor does a test of wills against Sauron, and Sauron deceives Denethor into thinking that the Corsairs are coming, and thus Minas Tirith is doomed. And this, of course, causes Denethor to go mad. And this is, again, a case of test of wills. There's no combat between Sauron and Denethor. It's all done through will. So I do think there's definitely a place for it in fantasy. So how would we steal the rules for this for Dungeons & Dragons? So what happens in Deadlands is there's 3 different kinds of tests of wills. First, you can do ridicule. So you're making fun of somebody and then they kind of lose their temper and composure. The second is a bluff. So, a deception. And then the third is overawe. And that's the stereotypical stare down. So how would we implement these in Dungeons and Dragons? Well, first off, it's an opposed roll. We already have rules for opposed rolls. In this case, the rolls clearly are active, they're not passive, so both sides would roll. If it was a deception, you would imagine it would probably be deception versus insight. Now, if it was ridicule, I think then maybe we would do performance. Now, I like the idea of having performance actually get involved in the rules because it's one of those skills that just doesn't come up very often. I'd love to see it come up more. Now, I'm not sure what it would be opposed by because we don't really have, temper skill. So, you could use a wisdom saving throw or maybe you just use insight again. And then overall, I think obviously intimidation versus intimidation. And then what you need is some kind of mechanical benefit for winning this contest. So there's normally 3 levels for losing the Battle of Wills in Deadlands. You can become unnerved, you can become distracted, or you can become outright broken. So what I would think in D&D is that if you won the contest, obviously if the contest is a tie, nothing happens. But if you win the contest by 1 to 4, then you unnerve your enemy. And if they're unnerved, they're going to get disadvantage on their next ability check, which may be, depending on the situation, an initiative roll, right? So then if you get that second level, which is distracted, you would need to win that contest by 5 to 9. So if you beat that contest by at least 5, then they're distracted, not just unnerved, and then they take disadvantage on their next ability check and their next attack roll. And then if you just overwhelm them, so you beat them by 10 or more on that contest, then they are broken. And if they are broken, they will have disadvantage on their next ability check, their next attack roll, and their next saving throw, which can be horrible. Now, I think it would be really important in Deadlands, it is up to the Marshal, which is the game master, to determine when a test of wills takes place. So in Dungeons & Dragons, it would be the dungeon master who would determine if and when a test of wills could take place. Otherwise, it's something that could be abused by players. And that brings us to our 5th rule I'd like to steal from another role-playing game for Dungeons & Dragons. And that one is going to come from another one of my favorites that I played many, many, many hours of, Vampire the Masquerade. If you haven't played Vampire the Masquerade, you should. It is a super fun game. Now, it is light on mechanics. It is very heavy on theme, and the mechanics, some of them are really good and some of them aren't. But you know what? Some of them are really good. Now, in Vampire, what we do when we take an action is we roll a die pool. So you have a certain number of dots on your character sheet, and that's the number of d10s that you roll to do that check. And then you have a certain difficulty or a certain number you need to achieve. So you roll 5 dice, and you needed to achieve 6s. Well, if you got 2 of those dice, 6 or higher, you get 2 levels of success. Now that doesn't translate well to D&D at all. What does translate to D&D, or could translate to D&D, is that there's an additional mechanic when you roll these checks, and that is if you roll a 10 on any of those d10s, you get another die. So if you roll those 5 dice and 2 of them are 10s, you get 2 additional dice to roll. And if those 2 are 10s, you get 2 more additional dice. And it just keeps going until you don't roll a 10. And what that does is it takes things that are really difficult to achieve and makes them, at least in theory, possible. So how would this translate to D&D? Well, if we're playing D&D, we're rolling a d20. And I think it's pretty common knowledge that when you roll a 20 in D&D, it's not actually such a big deal. If we're rolling an ability check or we're rolling a saving throw, a 20 is no different than any other number, other than there's a better chance of it being a success. But you don't automatically succeed if you roll a 20 if you're doing an ability check or saving throw. And if you needed a 10 to succeed, a 20 is no better than a 10. Now, in ability checks, sometimes there's degrees of success. So then it might be a little bit better, but it's not significantly better than a 19, for example. And then we know that if you roll a 20 in combat, then it's an automatic hit, and an automatic critical. And with critical, you re-roll your damage dice and add that to the total. And sometimes that can be dramatic, and sometimes it can be super underwhelming. I probably see as many criticals in Dungeons & Dragons deliver average or less than average damage for a hit for that attack. So what would we do here? Well, if we're rolling an ability check or a skill check, if you roll a 20, you roll again and add it to the result. And then, technically speaking, if you roll another 20, you would add that, and so on. And what it would do is, if you roll a 20, there's a really good chance of you succeeding on something that would otherwise maybe be impossible or nearly impossible. Now, what we would do in combat is if you roll a 20, you get a crit, just like normal. But you would also roll that d20 again. If you rolled a 20 again, well, then instead of doubling our damage dice, we would triple them. And if we rolled a 20 again, we would quadruple them. And then if we rolled a 20 again, well, then I'm inspecting that die, because there's just no way, right? But what we would see is occasionally, basically 1 out of every 20 criticals, there would be an additional level of damage. And what that might do is it might make characters that do decent damage on criticals because they have extra dice of damage. Maybe they're rogues, maybe they are barbarians. Then they would get a little advantage there. It would just be pretty small. It wouldn't come up all that often. But when it did, it could be a significant amount of damage, even on a second 20. And on the rare occasion where they might roll a third 20, it's going to be a significant amount of damage pretty much for any character. Now, word of caution, if I was to do this, I think I would do it for player characters only. Because when you start playing around with critical hits like that, where even in theory it's possible to do multiple levels of damage, what's going to happen is you're going to have some goblin or something attack a player character, and you're going to roll like 3 20s, and you know what's going to happen? Insta death. And that kind of randomness, I think, can be fun for players, but it can be bad to add to monsters. But as I've talked about on this channel before, monsters and player characters use different rules. The rules in the player's handbook don't necessarily all apply to monsters, and vice versa. So there's no reason we can't have this in effect for player characters and not have it in effect for monsters. So that is the way I would handle that. So there it is. Those are 5 rules that I would take from other role-playing games and steal them for D&D, and how I would go about stealing them. There's probably many more if I went through all the books. I basically stopped when I got to 5, so I don't know. Maybe I'll look at some more and see if there's some more rules I'd steal. But these are all rules I would definitely consider stealing. So that is it. Until next time, I'm going to sit back, I'm going to relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.